In Ottawa, on a hill overlooking the frozen Rideau River, there stands a mansion that was never meant to be a symbol of anything: Rideau Hall. The name comes from the waterway that cuts through the wilderness, rideau meaning curtain in French, for the way water cascades like fabric over the falls. 88 acres of parkland in the heart of what would become a capital city. 175 rooms sprawling across wings added over decades. A house so large that it required a staff of over 100 to maintain properly. Thomas McKay built the original structure in the 1832, when Ottawa was still called Bytown, and Canada as a nation did not yet exist. He filled it with the finest furnishings a Scottish stonemason turned lumber baron could afford. He hosted politicians, military officers, and anyone who mattered in a rough frontier town trying to become something more. He believed his family would occupy it for generations. He was wrong. After his death, the property changed hands, changed purpose entirely, and became something McKay never imagined. The British Crown purchased it. Canadian governors lived there. Prime ministers walked its halls. Kings and queens slept in its bedrooms. For over 150 years, Rideau Hall has served as the official residence of every Governor-General of Canada, a building that witnessed the birth of a nation and the slow, awkward separation from the empire that created it. But before any of that, before Confederation, before the title Governor-General meant anything to Canadians, before politicians argued over its future, the story begins with a different kind of power. The power of stone and timber and water. The power to transform wilderness into wealth. Understanding Rideau Hall requires understanding the man who built it and the place that made him rich. That place was barely mapped when he arrived. And the wealth came from trees. The winter of 1817 was brutal even by Scottish standards. Thomas McKay, 22 years old, stood on the docks at Leith Harbour near Edinburgh watching his uncle load construction equipment onto a ship bound for British North America. Alexander McKay had secured a contract to build locks on a military canal the British government planned through the Canadian wilderness. He needed skilled workers. Thomas was a stonemason, trained in the craft since childhood. The work in Scotland was steady but offered no fortune. The New World promised something different. They sailed in March as ice began breaking up in the Atlantic. 6 weeks later, they reached Montreal. From there, they traveled up the St. Lawrence to Kingston, then overland to the Ottawa River Valley. The landscape Thomas encountered was nothing like the ordered farms and ancient villages of Scotland. Dense forest stretched in every direction. Rivers cut through rock that had never seen a chisel. The few settlements consisted of rough log structures housing soldiers, fur traders, and the occasional farmer attempting to clear land. The British wanted a secure military route connecting Montreal to the Great Lakes. The existing path along the street, Lawrence sat too close to the American border. Memories of the War of 1812 remained fresh. An invading American force could easily cut the vital supply line. Lieutenant Colonel John By of the Royal Engineers had been dispatched to construct an alternate route. The Rideau Canal would run 200 kilometers through wilderness, connecting the Ottawa River to Lake Ontario at Kingston. It would require 47 locks, multiple dams, and more stone masonry than any project yet attempted in British North America. By needed workers who understood stone, Alexander McKay brought his nephew Thomas specifically because the young man possessed skills the project desperately required. Construction began in the fall of 1826. Thomas McKay quickly distinguished himself. While other workers struggled with the Canadian winter and the back-breaking labor of moving massive stone blocks, McKay thrived. He understood how to cut stone so it would fit precisely. He knew which rock would hold under pressure and which would crack when water froze inside. By 1827, Colonel By had promoted McKay to superintendent of masonry works. The position came with substantial pay and authority over hundreds of laborers. McKay managed the construction of multiple lock stations along the canal route. He hired workers, procured materials, and solved engineering problems as they emerged. The work was dangerous. Men died regularly in blasting accidents, from falls, from disease. Malaria killed more workers than any other cause. The mosquitoes that swarmed from the swamps surrounding the construction sites carried death that no amount of skill or caution could prevent. But for those who survived, the canal offered opportunity. By paid well. Workers with specialized skills earned more in a season than they could make in years back home. And McKay, as a contractor rather than merely a laborer, was accumulating real wealth. In 1828, McKay married Anne Crichton, daughter of a British Army officer. The marriage connected him to the military establishment that governed the region. The Crichtons had connections. McKay had money and ambition. Together they represented the kind of alliance that built colonial societies. By 1832, the Rideau Canal was complete. The project had cost far more than budgeted and taken longer than planned. Colonel By was recalled to London and died in disgrace, blamed for the overruns. But McKay emerged from the project as one of the wealthiest men in the Ottawa Valley. He had earned enormous sums as a contractor. More importantly, he understood something about the region that most settlers had missed. The real fortune wasn't in stone. It was in trees. The forests covering millions of acres around Ottawa represented wealth almost beyond calculation. Britain's shipyards needed timber. The Royal Navy consumed vast quantities, building and maintaining the fleet that controlled the seas. British forests had been depleted by centuries of harvesting. North American timber, particularly the massive white pines that grew throughout the Ottawa Valley, commanded premium prices in British markets. McKay had capital from his canal contracts. He had labor connections from managing hundreds of workers. He had relationships with British military authorities who controlled access to Crown lands. He began acquiring timber rights along the Rideau and Ottawa rivers. The business model was straightforward. Lumberjacks would cut trees during winter when frozen ground allowed easier transport. They would haul logs to riverbanks and wait for spring. When ice melted, they would float the timber downstream to Quebec City, where it was loaded onto ships bound for Britain. McKay established sawmills to process logs into standard sizes. He built workshops to manufacture barrels, doors, and other wooden products. He hired agents in Quebec to negotiate with ship captains and British buyers. Within 5 years of the canal's completion, McKay was running one of the largest lumber operations in the Ottawa Valley. The profits were extraordinary. A single raft of timber might contain 10,000 logs. One good season could earn a timber baron more than a gentleman farmer in England would see in a lifetime. McKay reinvested aggressively. More timber rights, more mills, more workers. The business grew until he controlled vast stretches of forest and employed hundreds of men. He needed a residence that reflected his new status. The log house he had occupied during the canal years would no longer suffice. In the early 1832s, Bytown was still rough. Fewer than 2,000 people lived in the settlement. Most buildings were simple wooden structures. There were taverns for the lumberjacks and soldiers. A few shops sold basic supplies. The surrounding area remained largely wilderness. McKay looked east of town, where the Rideau River curved through relatively flat land before dropping over falls. The location offered everything he needed: solid ground for building, access to clean water, proximity to the lumber operations he managed, and isolation from the rough elements of Bytown itself. He began purchasing property in 1835. He accumulated 88 acres, a substantial estate by any standard. The land stretched from the Rideau River back toward the forest. McKay envisioned something that would announce his arrival among the colony's elite. Not merely a house, but an estate that would rival anything in Montreal or Quebec. He hired builders in 1838. Construction began that spring. The original Rideau Hall was far more modest than the sprawling complex that stands today. McKay's initial design called for a two-story Regency-style villa constructed from limestone quarried from his own land. The stone was the same material he had worked with on the canal, pale gray blocks that could be precisely cut and fitted. The house would measure roughly 80 feet across the front with a center entrance hall and symmetrical wings. Large windows would capture southern light. A veranda would wrap around the main floor, providing outdoor space during the brief Canadian summer. McKay supervised construction personally. He understood stone better than any architect the colony could provide. He knew how thick walls needed to be to withstand winter cold. He specified the mortar mixture and the way stones should be laid for maximum strength. The house took 2 years to complete. By 1840, McKay, his wife Anne, and their growing family moved into Rideau Hall. The interior reflected the tastes of a man who had grown wealthy but had not forgotten his origins. The furnishings were fine but not ostentatious. Imported carpets covered wooden floors. Crystal chandeliers hung in the main rooms. But this was not a palace. It was the comfortable home of a successful businessman. The estate required staff. Servants maintained the house. Groundskeepers managed the extensive gardens that McKay had laid out around the residence. Stables housed horses for transportation. The property functioned as a working estate, producing food and providing employment to local workers. McKay used Rideau Hall exactly as he intended. He entertained business associates, hosted dinners for political figures passing through Bytown, and provided hospitality to visitors who came seeking contracts or connections. The house became a gathering place for anyone with ambition in the rough frontier town. But McKay was not just accumulating wealth. He was building infrastructure that would last far beyond his lifetime. In 1841, he founded New Edinburgh, a planned community adjacent to his estate. He laid out streets, built houses for workers, and established a market square. He constructed a Presbyterian church and donated funds for a school. The village would house the workers for his lumber operations and the craftsmen who supported the growing local economy. He also built a massive flour mill on the Rideau River Falls, just downstream from his estate. The mill used water power to process grain shipped from farms throughout the valley. Between lumber and flour, McKay controlled two of the most important commodities in the colony. Rideau Hall sat at the center of this small empire. From his study, McKay managed operations that extended hundreds of miles into the wilderness. He reviewed contracts, hired managers, and made decisions that affected hundreds of employees and their families. The house was not just a residence. It was the headquarters of a commercial operation that made McKay one of the wealthiest men in British North America. But wealth in the 1,840 seconds, Canada could disappear as quickly as it accumulated. Markets fluctuated. Timber prices rose and fell with British demand. Fires destroyed mills. Ice jams crushed logs waiting to be floated downriver. The business required constant attention and carried enormous risk. By the early 1,850 seconds, McKay was in his late 50s. He had survived the brutal work of canal construction. He had built a fortune from wilderness. He had created a community that bore his mark. His children were grown. His estate was established. And then, in 1855, everything changed. Thomas McKay died on October 25, 1855. He was 60 years old. The cause was recorded as inflammation of the lungs, likely pneumonia. His funeral at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in New Edinburgh drew hundreds of mourners. He was buried in the Beechwood Cemetery that he had helped establish. His estate passed to his wife Anne and their children. The lumber business continued. The properties remained valuable. But without McKay's direct management, the operations began to fragment. His sons took over portions of the business. Other associates acquired interests in the mills and timber rights. Rideau Hall itself remained with the family, but the house was too large for a widow and her adult children who had their own homes. For several years in the late 1852s, the residence sat partially occupied. Anne McKay remained, but entire wings went unused. The estate that had been designed as a center of activity began to feel empty. Then, in 1864, the Canadian government made a decision that would change Rideau Hall forever. Confederation was approaching. The separate colonies of British North America would soon unite into a single dominion. This new nation would need a capital, and that capital would need a residence for the representative of the British Crown. The Governor-General would require a suitable home. The British North America Act passed in 1867, creating the Dominion of Canada. 4 provinces united under a federal system that maintained ties to the British Crown while granting substantial self-governance. Queen Victoria would remain head of state, but Canada would govern its own internal affairs through an elected parliament and appointed prime ministers. The Governor-General served as the Queen's representative. The position carried enormous authority in theory, less in practice. The Governor-General would sign legislation into law, summon and dissolve Parliament, and serve as Commander-in-Chief of Canadian forces. But by the 1862s, Britain had largely adopted the convention that colonial governors would follow the advice of elected local leaders. The position was becoming ceremonial, but ceremony required appropriate setting. The Governor-General needed a residence that would project the dignity and authority of the Crown without appearing to overshadow the elected Canadian government. The location needed to be in Ottawa, which had been selected as the capital in 1857. Several properties were considered. None quite fit the requirements. Government officials wanted something substantial but not palatial, something that could accommodate official entertaining but wasn't so large as to be wasteful, something that already existed so construction costs could be avoided. Rideau Hall emerged as the obvious choice. The McKay family still owned the property, but they were willing to sell. The house sat on extensive grounds that could provide security and privacy. The location was close enough to Parliament Hill for convenience, but far enough to provide separation between the ceremonial and political functions of government. In September of 1868, the Canadian government purchased Rideau Hall for $82,000, equivalent to approximately $1.6 million today. The sum represented a bargain. The property alone was worth more than the purchase price. The government was buying Thomas McKay's estate for considerably less than he had invested in building it. Renovations began immediately. The house McKay had built was impressive by Bytown standards in 1840, but it was insufficient for vice-regal purposes in 1868. Additional wings were needed for staff quarters. A ballroom was required for official entertainments. Staterooms would host diplomatic receptions. Architects drew plans for substantial additions. The work continued through 1868 and into early 1869. The first Governor-General to occupy Rideau Hall was Viscount Monk. He had served as Governor-General of the Province of Canada before Confederation and had been retained in the position for the new Dominion. But Monk was preparing to return to Ireland. His tenure at Rideau Hall lasted only months. The man who would truly define what Rideau Hall would become arrived in June of 1872. Baron Lisgar had served briefly, but the next Governor-General would transform the residence from McKay's stone villa into something approaching a palace. Sir John Young, Lord Lisgar, departed in June of 1872. 2 days later, the Earl of Dufferin stepped off the train in Ottawa and into a role that would consume the next 6 years of his life. Frederick Temple Blackwood, the Earl of Dufferin, was 46 years old. He was a career diplomat who had served in Russia, Syria, and Egypt. He spoke multiple languages. He had written travel books. He possessed charm, intelligence, and the kind of aristocratic confidence that made him comfortable among both royalty and commoners. More importantly, he understood exactly what his role required. The Governor-General was meant to embody the British Crown in Canada while remaining above Canadian politics. He would represent continuity, stability, and tradition in a young nation still finding its identity. He would host, entertain, and travel constantly, making the crown visible throughout the Dominion. His wife, Harriot, Countess of Dufferin, would be equally important. Vice-regal entertaining depended on a hostess who could manage large events with grace and create an atmosphere of refined elegance that would impress visiting dignitaries and Canadian society alike. The Dufferins arrived at Rideau Hall and immediately recognized its potential and its limitations. The house was adequate but plain. The additions made since 1868 had increased capacity but had done little to create the kind of setting that would impress representatives from European courts. The grounds were extensive but largely undeveloped. Dufferin began lobbying the government for funds to expand and improve the residence. Canadian politicians were reluctant. The country was young and poor. Spending public money on a mansion for a British aristocrat seemed difficult to justify to voters who lived in far more modest circumstances. Dufferin persisted. He argued that the Governor-General's residence served diplomatic purposes. Foreign representatives judged Canada by the quality of its official hospitality. A shabby residence made Canada appear insignificant. The government eventually authorized modest improvements. Dufferin supplemented the funds with his own money. Construction began in 1873. A new ballroom was added, measuring over 4,000 square feet with 20-foot ceilings. The room could accommodate several hundred guests for receptions and dances. Large windows provided natural light during day events. Crystal chandeliers imported from Europe would illuminate evening entertainments. Additional staterooms were constructed for smaller diplomatic meetings and formal dinners. The tent room was created, a unique space with a ceiling draped in fabric to resemble a military campaign tent. The design reflected both Dufferin's diplomatic experience in exotic locations and the Victorian fascination with Orientalist aesthetics. New staff quarters were built, separate from the main house but connected by covered walkways. The Governor-General's household included not just servants but military aides, secretaries, and officials who managed the ceremonial aspects of the position. All needed proper accommodation. The grounds received equal attention. Dufferin was an enthusiastic ice skater. He had a large outdoor rink constructed and flooded each winter. Skating parties at Rideau Hall became famous. Cabinet ministers, Supreme Court justices, military officers, and visiting dignitaries would gather on the ice while torches and lanterns provided light after sunset. The Countess of Dufferin was equally energetic. She established a regular calendar of events that would define the social season in Ottawa. Weekly drawing rooms where elite Ottawa society could be presented to the vice-regal couple. State dinners for visiting officials. Garden parties in summer. Sleigh rides in winter. The entertainment served a purpose beyond mere socializing. Canada, in the 1,870 was deeply divided. The new confederation brought together regions that had been separate colonies with different traditions, languages, and loyalties. Ontario had been English and Protestant. Quebec was French and Catholic. The Maritime provinces viewed central Canada with suspicion. The West was barely settled. Rideau Hall became neutral ground where these divisions could be temporarily set aside. A French-Canadian politician and an English-Canadian businessman might both receive invitations to a Dufferin garden party. They would share the same lawn, eat from the same buffet, and exchange pleasantries even if they fought bitterly in Parliament. The residence became a place where being Canadian mattered more than which province you represented or which language you spoke. Dufferin understood this instinctively. He made a point of traveling throughout the Dominion during his tenure. He visited remote settlements in Manitoba. He toured British Columbia before the railway connected it to the east. He became the first Governor-General to travel by train across the country when the Canadian Pacific Railway completed the transcontinental line. When he returned to Rideau Hall from these tours, he brought stories and observations that he shared at dinners and receptions. He made distant parts of the country feel more connected to Ottawa. He helped create the beginning of a shared national identity. The Dufferin years established patterns that subsequent governors-general would follow. Rideau Hall was no longer just a residence. It was an institution, the ceremonial heart of Canadian government, a symbol of continuity linking the young Dominion to centuries of British constitutional tradition. When the Dufferins departed in 1878, they left behind a residence that had been thoroughly transformed. The house had doubled in size. The grounds were developed with skating rinks, gardens, and walking paths. The social calendar was established. The role of Rideau Hall in Canadian public life was defined. What came next would test whether these traditions could survive changing times and changing relationships between Canada and Britain. The Marquess of Lorne arrived in November 1878 with a wife who was unlike any previous vice-regal consort. Princess Louise was Queen Victoria's fourth daughter. She was 30 years old, artistically talented, and deeply uncomfortable with the prospect of spending years in a colonial backwater. The marriage to Lorne had been arranged to cement ties between the royal family and a prominent Scottish aristocratic family. The Governor-General posting was meant to give the couple something useful to do while keeping Louise far from European court intrigues that her mother, the Queen, found distracting. Louise hated Ottawa almost immediately. The winter cold was far worse than anything in Scotland. The society was provincial compared to London. Rideau Hall, despite Dufferin's improvements, struck her as rustic and poorly furnished. She wrote letters home complaining about the isolation and the quality of Canadian hospitality. Yet her presence changed Rideau Hall in fundamental ways. For the first time, actual royalty occupied the residence. Princess Louise was not merely representing the crown. She was the crown's daughter. Canadian society responded with an intensity that surprised everyone. Invitations to Rideau Hall events became desperately sought after. Being presented to Princess Louise became a social achievement that families would discuss for generations. The mere possibility of encountering royalty made Rideau Hall more important than any previous Governor-General had managed. Louise reluctantly fulfilled her ceremonial obligations. She hosted drawing rooms and received delegations. But she also pursued her own interests in ways that previous vice-regal consorts had not. She was a sculptor and painter. She convinced Lorne to support the creation of the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts in 1880. She personally involved herself in artistic matters, reviewing submissions and offering opinions that artists both welcomed and resented. Her presence also highlighted the inherent contradictions in Canada's constitutional arrangement. Louise was royalty. Lorne was nobility but not royal. Yet he held the authority while she was merely his wife. The Canadian government took direction from Lorne while treating Louise with the deference due a princess. The confusion about precedence and protocol created constant minor crises. Who sat where at state dinners? Who entered rooms in what order? The Canadian Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, found the entire situation exhausting. He had to manage a Governor-General who had limited actual power while also accommodating a princess who had no official role but could not be ignored. Rideau Hall during the Lorne years became a strange hybrid. It functioned as a vice-regal residence but also as a royal court in miniature. British protocol dominated even as Canadian national feeling grew stronger. The tension would only increase in subsequent decades. Lorne and Louise departed in 1883. Their tenure had lasted 5 years, longer than many expected given Louise's obvious displeasure with Canada. The residence they left behind was physically unchanged but symbolically more important. The Governor-General's residence had hosted actual royalty. That fact would shape expectations for every subsequent occupant. The Lansdownes came next. then Stanley, then Aberdeen. Each Governor-General made minor modifications to the House. Each hosted their own version of the social season. The patterns Dufferin had established continued with variations based on individual personalities and changing times, but larger forces were reshaping Canada and its relationship with Britain. The country was growing. Immigration was increasing. The West was filling with settlers. Economic development was accelerating. Canadian politicians were becoming more assertive about governing without British interference. The Governor-General's role was slowly becoming more ceremonial and less powerful. By the early 1900s, Canadian prime ministers made the important decisions. The Governor-General signed documents and hosted parties but had little influence over actual policy. The position was turning into what it remains today, a ceremonial figurehead representing constitutional continuity but wielding no real authority. Rideau Hall reflected this transition. The entertaining continued. The social season remained important to Ottawa's elite. But the political significance was fading. What had begun as the residence of the Crown's powerful representative was becoming a museum of traditions that mattered less each year. The 20th century would force even more dramatic changes. The Duke of Connaught arrived in 1911 as Canada's Governor-General, carrying a title that seemed almost designed to intimidate. Prince Arthur William Patrick Albert, third son of Queen Victoria, had been a career military officer for 4 decades. He was 61 years old, formal, precise, and utterly committed to royal protocol and British imperial interests. His appointment represented a deliberate decision by the British government. Canada was growing more independent. The Prime Minister, Sir Robert Borden, was pushing for Canadian control over foreign policy and military affairs. London wanted someone at Rideau Hall who would resist this drift toward autonomy. A prince of the blood might carry enough personal authority to slow the inevitable. Connaught transformed Rideau Hall into something closer to a royal residence than it had been even under Princess Louise. He brought a massive household from England: military aides, personal servants, secretaries. The staff quarters that had seemed adequate were suddenly overcrowded. Additional buildings were constructed to house everyone. The Duke insisted on elaborate ceremony. Formal uniforms were required for official events. Strict rules governed who could be presented at court and under what circumstances. Canadian politicians and society figures who had treated previous governors-general with friendly informality found themselves navigating European court protocol. Connaught also spent lavishly. He used both government funds and his own substantial wealth to redecorate portions of Rideau Hall. European furniture replaced simpler Canadian pieces. Additional artwork was acquired. The residence began to look like an outpost of Buckingham Palace. But the Duke's tenure coincided with events that would fundamentally alter Canada's relationship with Britain. In August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Because Canada was part of the British Empire, the declaration automatically applied to Canada as well. No one had consulted the Canadian government. No vote had occurred in the Canadian Parliament. The country was at war because London said so. Over 600,000 Canadians would eventually serve in World War I. More than 60,000 would die. The casualties concentrated in a few horrific battles: Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, the Somme. The sacrifice transformed Canadian national consciousness. The country that entered the war as a British dominion emerged from it, demanding recognition as an independent nation that had earned respect through blood. Prime Minister Borden insisted that Canada receive a seat at the Paris Peace Conference as a separate nation, not merely as part of the British delegation. He fought for Canadian membership in the new League of Nations. He pushed for Canadian control over foreign policy. The Governor-General's role became increasingly awkward. Connaught represented the King and the British government. But Canadian politicians no longer wanted British interference in Canadian affairs. The constitutional crisis was approaching. Should the Governor-General follow the advice of the Canadian Prime Minister or take direction from London? Connaught tried to maintain both loyalties. He forwarded Canadian government requests to Britain while simultaneously reporting Canadian political developments back to London in ways that sometimes contradicted what Canadian ministers were saying publicly. The duplicity was necessary given his impossible position, but it eroded trust. The Duke departed in 1916, 3 years into the war. His replacement, the Duke of Devonshire, inherited a country that had changed profoundly. Canadian nationalism had been awakened by wartime sacrifice. The old assumptions about British authority over Canadian affairs no longer held. Rideau Hall, after 1916, became the residence of a constitutional figurehead rather than a powerful imperial representative. The transition was painful and incomplete, but irreversible. By 1919, Canada was signing international treaties independently of Britain. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster formally recognized Canadian sovereignty in foreign affairs. The Governor-General officially became the representative of the Canadian Crown, not the British Crown, though the same person, the British monarch, held both positions. The distinction was technical but crucial. Rideau Hall was now Canadian. Subsequent Governors-General were selected with Canadian input and served Canadian interests, even while maintaining the symbolic connection to the monarchy. The house that Thomas McKay built, and that the Duffrens had transformed into a vice-regal palace, had evolved again into something else entirely. It was the official residence of a ceremonial head of state in a fully independent nation that happened to share a monarch with Britain. The architecture remained. The grounds were still maintained. The entertaining continued. But the meaning had changed completely. The interwar years brought a succession of governors-general who occupied Rideau Hall without making dramatic changes to the residence itself. The house had reached its essential final form. Additional minor modifications occurred, a new wing here, updated utilities there, but the basic structure established by the Dufferins and expanded by subsequent occupants remained intact. What changed was the relationship between the Governor-General and Canadian society. The position was losing its connection to the British aristocracy that had defined it for decades. In 1952, Vincent Massey became the first Canadian-born Governor-General. The appointment marked a watershed. For 85 years, the position had been filled by British noblemen sent from London. Now a Canadian would represent the Crown in Canada. Massey was perfect for the role, educated at Oxford, wealthy, sophisticated, and deeply committed to Canadian arts and culture. He had served as Canada's High Commissioner to Britain during World War II. He understood both Canadian and British society intimately. His appointment signaled that Canada was confident enough to provide its own ceremonial head of state. Massey's tenure at Rideau Hall from 1952 to 1959 established new patterns. He used the residence to promote Canadian culture. Artists, writers, and musicians received invitations to events that previously had been dominated by politicians and diplomats. The house became a showcase for Canadian achievement rather than merely a symbol of constitutional continuity with Britain. He also opened Rideau Hall to the public in ways previous occupants had not. Guided tours were introduced. The grounds were made accessible. Canadians who would never attend a state dinner could now walk through the gardens where Dufferin had held skating parties decades earlier. The democratization continued under subsequent governors-general. Georges Vanier, who served from 1959 to 1967, was the first French-Canadian in the role. His appointment recognized Quebec's place in Confederation during a period of rising Quebec nationalism. Roland Michener, Vanier's successor, was a career politician and lawyer who had served as Speaker of the House of Commons. The position was becoming a reward for distinguished Canadians rather than a posting for British aristocrats. By the 1972nd, the Governor-General's role had been fully redefined. The occupant of Rideau Hall still signed legislation, summoned Parliament, and performed constitutional duties. But these acts were entirely ceremonial. Real power rested with the Prime Minister and elected government. The Governor-General embodied national unity and constitutional continuity. Nothing more, but also nothing less. Rideau Hall itself became a museum of Canadian history. The rooms where Dufferin had entertained now hosted events celebrating Canadian diversity. The ballroom, where Princess Louise had reluctantly fulfilled her obligations, now welcomed Indigenous leaders, immigrant communities, and representatives of every region and culture that comprised modern Canada. The grounds where Connaught had insisted on rigid British protocol now hosted Canada Day celebrations open to the public. The skating rink that Dufferin had built remained, but now ordinary Ottawa residents used it alongside government officials. The transformation was complete. Thomas McKay's limestone villa, purchased by the government to house a British imperial representative, had become the symbolic home of Canadian democracy. The residence of appointed governors-general who held no real power, but represented something Canadians still valued: continuity, tradition, and the complicated history that connected a modern independent nation to the British constitutional system that had shaped its founding. But preserving this symbol came at increasing cost. By the 1992, Rideau Hall required extensive restoration. The original stone that McKay had quarried in the 1830s was deteriorating. The additions made by various governors-general over 130 years had created a complex of buildings with different structural systems and maintenance needs. The Canadian government faced a decision: invest millions in preserving a residence that served primarily ceremonial purposes, or allow the slow deterioration to continue and eventually replace the structure with something more practical. The debate reflected fundamental questions about national identity. What obligation did Canada have to preserve buildings that represented a colonial past? Did maintaining Rideau Hall honor Canadian history or perpetuate outdated connections to British monarchy? The government chose preservation. Extensive restoration work began in the late 1990s and continued into the 2000s. The original McKay structure was reinforced and restored. Later additions were preserved where possible or rebuilt to match historical designs where necessary. The project cost exceeded $100 million and took years to complete. When finished, Rideau Hall looked much as it had during the Dufferin era, with Victorian-era grandeur carefully maintained through modern construction techniques and materials. The restored residence continues to function as the Governor-General's official home. It hosts state dinners for visiting heads of state. It serves as the location for presenting honors and awards to distinguished Canadians. Its grounds host thousands of visitors each year. But the meaning of Rideau Hall in the 21st century bears little resemblance to what Thomas McKay intended when he built his retirement villa in 1840, or what the Dufferins created when they transformed it into a vice-regal palace in the 1872, or what Connaught imagined when he ran it as an outpost of British royal authority in the 1910s. The building that stands today is an artifact, a physical reminder of how dramatically Canada's relationship with Britain has evolved over 150 years. When the government purchased McKay's property in 1868, Canada was barely a year old and still deeply dependent on British military protection, British capital investment, and British immigrants. The Governor-General wielded genuine power. The residence from which he operated mattered. By 2024, Canada is a fully independent nation with its own foreign policy, its own military, its own constitutional arrangements that happen to share a ceremonial monarch with Britain but have no practical dependence on London. The Governor-General signs documents that the elected government presents, nothing more. The residence from which this ceremonial signing occurs could theoretically be anywhere, That Canada chooses to maintain Rideau Hall at considerable expense says something about the complicated relationship Canadians have with their own history. The building represents both colonial subjugation and the peaceful path to independence. It symbolizes British heritage and Canadian achievement. It reminds Canadians of where they came from while saying nothing definitive about where they should go. Thomas McKay built it as a businessman's estate, proof that a Scottish stonemason could become wealthy in the Canadian wilderness. The Canadian government bought it as a residence for Britain's representative, a symbol of imperial authority in a new dominion. Subsequent governors-general transformed it into a palace that could host royalty and impress foreign dignitaries. Modern Canada maintains it as a museum of its own constitutional evolution, a building that witnessed the transition from colony to nation while remaining physically intact even as its meaning changed completely. The irony is considerable. McKay, who built the original house, died never imagining it would become anything more than his family home. The early governors-general, who transformed it into a symbol of British imperial power, could not have predicted that Britain's influence over Canada would fade so completely. The Canadian politicians who fought to reduce the Governor-General's authority from real power to pure ceremony did not foresee that future generations would spend millions preserving the residence as a heritage site. Rideau Hall endures not because anyone planned for it to become a national monument, but because it survived long enough to become irreplaceable. The layers of history embedded in its stones and added wings tell a story that no other building in Canada can match. The original McKay Villa, the Dufferin additions, the Connaught modifications, the Massey democratization, the modern restorations, each era left its mark. Walk through Rideau Hall today and you are walking through Canadian history. The ballroom remembers when it hosted actual British royalty and when that mattered. The staterooms recall when the Governor-General made decisions that shaped Canadian policy. The modernized infrastructure acknowledges that even ceremonial institutions need contemporary systems to function. The public access points recognize that buildings funded by taxpayers should serve taxpayers, not just elites. This is what Rideau Hall has become. A building that belongs to everyone precisely because it once belonged only to the most privileged. The current occupant, regardless of who holds the position when you read this, lives in a house that has witnessed conversations that shaped Canada's destiny. Prime ministers from Macdonald to Trudeau have walked these halls. Kings and queens have slept in these bedrooms. Treaties have been signed in these rooms. Constitutional crises have played out within these walls. The building has absorbed all of it, remaining physically present even as the people and the politics changed completely. Modern governors-general occupy Rideau Hall, understanding that they are temporary custodians of something larger than themselves. They live in bedrooms where British princes slept. They host dinners in rooms designed to impress European aristocrats. They work in offices where representatives of the Crown once wielded genuine power over Canadian affairs. But they do all of this knowing their own role is purely symbolic. The power resides elsewhere, in Parliament, in the Prime Minister's office, in the democratic institutions that Canadians control through elections. The Governor-General inhabits Rideau Hall as a living reminder that democracy in Canada evolved gradually, through negotiation and constitutional evolution, rather than through violent revolution. The maintenance costs remain substantial. The Government of Canada spends millions annually keeping Rideau Hall functional. Staff salaries, utilities, repairs, security, grounds maintenance, the expenses never end. Critics periodically question whether this expenditure serves any useful purpose. Could Canada function perfectly well with the Governor-General living in a normal house and conducting official business in a government office building? The answer is obviously yes. The constitutional functions could be performed anywhere, but doing so would sever a physical connection to Canadian history that cannot be replicated once destroyed. Rideau Hall is not merely a building, it is a timeline made tangible. You can walk from McKay's original stone villa into the Dufferin Ballroom into the modern offices and literally move through Canadian history with each step. That experience has value that transcends any economic calculation. Schools bring students to tour Rideau Hall precisely because the building teaches Canadian history in ways textbooks cannot match. Standing in the ballroom where Princess Louise reluctantly hosted receptions makes the Victorian era real rather than abstract. Seeing the rooms where wartime governors-general worked during World War I and II connects students to Canada's military history. Understanding that the same building served both as a symbol of British imperial authority and as the residence of Canadian-born governors-general who represented Canadian independence illustrates the peaceful evolution of Canadian sovereignty. The grounds serve similar purposes. The skating rink that Dufferin built still operates each winter. The gardens that various governors-general planted and expanded remain open to visitors. The grounds have hosted everything from state funerals to Canada Day celebrations. The physical space has accommodated the full range of Canadian public life for over 150 years. This continuity matters in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. Canada is a young country that sometimes struggles to articulate what makes it distinct. The country is not American, though it shares a continent and many cultural similarities. It is not British, though it maintains constitutional connections to the monarchy. It is not French, though Quebec represents a significant French-speaking population with distinct identity. Canada is something else, a confederation that has held together through compromise and accommodation rather than through the force of a single dominant culture. Rideau Hall embodies this messy, complicated Canadian identity. The building reflects British architectural traditions but was constructed by a Scottish immigrant using Canadian materials. It served British imperial interests but became a symbol of Canadian independence. It housed aristocratic governors-general who lived like royalty and democratic governors-general who opened the residence to ordinary Canadians. It represents both colonial subjugation and peaceful decolonization. It is simultaneously a monument to Canada's British heritage and to Canada's successful separation from Britain. Only Canada could create such a contradictory symbol and then spend millions preserving it. The Indigenous history of the land complicates the narrative further. Before Thomas McKay built his villa, before Bytown existed, before European settlement began, the Ottawa River Valley was home to Algonquin peoples who had lived on this land for thousands of years. The 88 acres that became Rideau Hall were never empty wilderness waiting for development. They were territory taken from Indigenous peoples through treaties that were often violated and through displacement that was rarely acknowledged. Modern governors-general have begun incorporating this history into how Rideau Hall functions. Indigenous leaders receive invitations to state events. Indigenous art appears alongside European paintings in the public rooms. Ceremonies acknowledge that Rideau Hall sits on unceded Algonquin territory. The recognition does not undo historical injustices, but it acknowledges that Canadian history includes more than the European colonial narrative that dominated for over a century. This, too, becomes part of what Rideau Hall represents. A building that once symbolized British imperial authority now hosts ceremonies recognizing Indigenous sovereignty. A residence that excluded Indigenous peoples from its social calendar for decades now welcomes Indigenous leaders as honored guests. The evolution reflects broader changes in Canadian society, changes that are still incomplete and still contested, but undeniably underway. The building adapts because it must. Institutions that cannot adapt become irrelevant. Rideau Hall has survived by remaining useful even as its purpose changed. McKay's villa served his business operations. The early vice-regal residence projected British imperial power. The mid-20th century palace promoted Canadian culture. The modern heritage site educates Canadians about their constitutional history while providing ceremonial space for state functions. Each transformation preserved the physical structure while completely altering its meaning. What comes next is uncertain. Canadian attitudes toward monarchy are shifting. Younger generations feel less attachment to British royal traditions than their grandparents did. Support for maintaining the constitutional monarchy versus becoming a republic fluctuates in polls, but generally trends toward increasing Republican sentiment. If Canada eventually severs its connection to the British Crown, what happens to Rideau Hall? The building would lose its constitutional purpose. The Governor-General position might be eliminated or transformed into an elected or appointed presidency. The residence might become purely a museum, or it might be repurposed entirely, or in the worst case, it might be sold and demolished as governments decided the maintenance costs could no longer be justified. This possibility explains why the recent extensive restorations matter. By investing over $100 million in preserving Rideau Hall, the Canadian government has effectively committed to maintaining the building for at least several more decades. The investment would make no sense if plans existed to abandon the residence in the near future. The restoration represents a bet that Canadian constitutional arrangements will remain stable and that Rideau Hall will continue serving its current function long enough to justify the expenditure. But history suggests that predictions about Rideau Hall's future have consistently been wrong. Thomas McKay did not build it to become a government residence. The Canadian government did not purchase it expecting that it would still be in use 150 years later. The governors-general who expanded it could not have imagined how completely their role would be transformed from powerful imperial representative to ceremonial figurehead. The building has survived and adapted through changes that no one predicted. Perhaps it will continue doing so. Perhaps 50 years from now, Rideau Hall will serve some purpose that current observers cannot imagine. Just as McKay could not have imagined Princess Louise hosting receptions in his villa, and just as the Dufferins could not have imagined a Canadian-born Governor-General democratizing access to the residence they had designed for elite entertaining. Or perhaps the building will finally succumb to the economics and politics that nearly destroyed it multiple times. The federal government rejected it in 1980 as too expensive to maintain. The Post Foundation prepared to demolish Mar-a-Lago in 1985 for similar reasons. Historic buildings survive because someone decides they are worth saving. That decision must be made repeatedly, every time maintenance costs mount, every time political priorities shift, every time a new generation questions why resources should be spent on preserving the past. Rideau Hall has survived every such decision point so far. The building stands today because enough Canadians have consistently believed that it deserves preservation. Whether that consensus will hold depends on whether future Canadians continue to value what Rideau Hall represents. For now, the residence remains. The current Governor-General lives and works in the same building where the Earl of Dufferin hosted skating parties in the 1872. State dinners still occur in rooms that Princess Louise found inadequate. The grounds that Thomas McKay developed as a gentleman's estate still provide parkland in the heart of Ottawa. The building that was never supposed to become anything more than a successful businessman's retirement home has become an institution that has witnessed and embodied 150 years of Canadian constitutional evolution. The story of Rideau Hall is ultimately a story about adaptation and survival. Buildings that serve only one purpose rarely last beyond the lifetime of their original function. McKay's villa could have been demolished when the timber business passed from family control. The government could have sold it when maintaining a vice-regal residence became politically awkward. Any of the governors-general who expanded it could have been the last. The building could have been destroyed by fire, which consumed many wooden structures in 19th-century Ottawa. It could have been replaced by something more modern during any of the decades when Victorian architecture was considered outdated. It survived because it kept finding new purposes. When it could no longer function as a private estate, it became a government residence. When it could no longer serve as a symbol of British imperial power, it became a symbol of Canadian independence. When it could no longer justify itself as an exclusive preserve of elites, it opened to the public. Each transformation preserved the physical structure by making it relevant to a new era. This adaptability explains why some buildings become permanent landmarks while others disappear. The buildings that last are the ones that keep mattering to each new generation, even if the reasons change completely. Canadians in 1870 valued Rideau Hall because it appropriately housed the Queen's representative. Canadians in 1920 valued it because it demonstrated that Canada had sophisticated institutions worthy of a sovereign nation. Canadians in 1970 valued it as a heritage site representing constitutional history. Canadians in 2024 value it for all these reasons and more, including as a venue for celebrating national achievements and as an educational resource that makes history tangible. Thomas McKay spent a fortune building a house that was supposed to pass to his children and remain in his family for generations. It remained in family hands for barely 30 years. The Canadian government purchased it, expecting to house the Governor-General for the foreseeable future, not imagining that 150 years later, the same building would still be serving essentially the same function. The gap between intentions and outcomes could not be larger. McKay's plan failed completely. The government's modest expectations were vastly exceeded. Yet both the failure and the success produced the same result, a building that endures. There is something deeply Canadian about this story. A Scottish immigrant builds a villa using stone he quarried himself, demonstrating that talent and hard work could create wealth in a frontier colony. The British government purchases it to house the Crown's representative, imposing imperial authority on a young dominion. Subsequent occupants transform it into a palace suitable for royalty, then gradually strip away the power while maintaining the ceremony. Modern Canadians preserve it as a heritage site while simultaneously questioning whether maintaining connections to monarchy makes sense in the 21st century. The contradictions never quite resolve. The building remains suspended between honoring the past and serving the present, between celebrating British heritage and asserting Canadian independence, between maintaining tradition and adapting to change. Most nations would find this situation intolerable. They would choose one narrative and enforce it consistently, either preserve the building exactly as it was, turning it into a museum frozen in a particular era, or modernize it completely, erasing the history in favor of contemporary utility. Canada does neither. Rideau Hall remains a working residence where history and modernity coexist awkwardly. A governor-general with no real power lives in a palace designed to project authority. Indigenous land acknowledgements occur in a building constructed on territory taken from Indigenous peoples. Public tours walk through rooms that once excluded everyone except the elite. The building embodies all of Canadian history simultaneously, the good and the bad, the colonial and the independent, the exclusive and the democratic. This is why Rideau Hall matters. Not because it is particularly beautiful, though portions of it are quite handsome. Not because it represents architectural innovation, though it contains fine examples of Victorian design. Not because it housed powerful people, though many powerful people have lived and worked there. It matters because it tells the Canadian story more honestly than any sanitized textbook or carefully curated museum exhibit ever could. The building's very contradictions reveal the truth about how Canada evolved from colony to nation. The process was messy. It involved compromise and gradual change rather than dramatic revolution. It left loose ends and unresolved questions. Power shifted slowly and incompletely. Old forms persisted even after their meaning changed. This is what Rideau Hall shows. Walk through the building today and you see all of it. The original McKay villa, solid and practical, built by a self-made man who came to Canada with nothing and died wealthy. The Dufferin additions, ambitious and elegant, designed to impress European visitors and establish Canada as a sophisticated nation. The later expansions, pragmatic and functional, acknowledging that ceremony requires adequate space and modern conveniences. The recent restorations, careful and expensive, preserving the past for a future that remains uncertain. Each layer tells part of the story. Together they tell the whole story. The story of a nation that is still trying to figure out what it wants to be while honoring what it has been. Thomas McKay never imagined his house would become this. The Earl of Dufferin would be astonished that the residence he expanded still functions 150 years later. The Duke of Connaught would be appalled that his ceremonial authority has been reduced to signing documents that others draft. Vincent Massey would be pleased that he helped transform the position into something distinctly Canadian. All of them would recognize the building. The stone that McKay quarried still forms the core. The ballroom that Dufferin added still hosts state dinners. The grounds that various occupants developed still provide space for public events. The physical structure has been maintained with remarkable fidelity to its historical appearance. But none of them would fully recognize what the building has become. It no longer serves the purposes any of them envisioned. It has been transformed by history into something that serves contemporary Canada, while bearing the marks of every era it has survived. This is Rideau Hall's ultimate achievement. It has become a building that belongs simultaneously to the past and the present, to the colonial history that shaped Canada, and to the independent nation that emerged from that history. It reminds Canadians where they came from while saying nothing definitive about where they must go. The building stands as witness to Canadian history, asking each generation to decide what this inheritance means and whether it deserves preservation for another generation to interpret differently. So far, the answer has been yes. Canadians have chosen to maintain Rideau Hall through economic downturns, political controversies, and shifting attitudes toward monarchy and national identity. The building survives because enough people continue to believe that some things are worth preserving even when their original purpose has vanished. Whether this consensus will hold is unknown. Future generations may decide that maintaining a Governor-General's residence makes no sense when the position has become purely ceremonial. They may conclude that the millions spent on maintenance would be better invested elsewhere. They may determine that Canada's constitutional arrangements need reform that would eliminate the position and the residence entirely. Or they may continue doing what Canadians have done for 150 years. Maintaining Rideau Hall while gradually changing what it represents, adapting an inherited structure to serve purposes that its original builders never imagined, preserving the physical building while completely transforming its meaning. If the past is any guide, Rideau Hall will survive. It will adapt. It will find new purposes that justify its preservation. And 50 years from now, observers will look back and wonder how the building managed to remain relevant through yet another era of dramatic change. The mansion that Thomas McKay built, that the Canadian government purchased, that generations of governors-general expanded and occupied, that modern Canada maintains as heritage site, will continue standing on that hill overlooking the Rideau River, bearing witness to whatever comes next in the ongoing story of Canadian nationhood. That was never the plan. But it is what happened. And that, perhaps, is the most Canadian thing about Rideau Hall. The building endures not because anyone designed it to last forever, but because it has proven useful enough to survive one more decade, one more generation, one more constitutional evolution. McKay's limestone blocks, quarried from Canadian rock by Scottish hands in the 1,830 seconds, remain as solid as the day they were laid. The building they form has housed 7 monarchs' representatives, witnessed the birth of a nation, survived wars and depressions, adapted to democracy, opened to the public, and become something its builder never imagined, and its early occupants could not have predicted. Yet it remains. The stone endures, the building survives, and Canadians continue deciding, year after year, that this complicated inheritance deserves preservation for whatever purposes the future might bring.